Yeah. Thank you.
That's how I'm going to introduce you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Lots of familiar faces that I'm glad to see. We're here tonight to talk about a new book, came out just last month, Guns, God, and Sedition, the Far-Right Terrorism in America. Obviously a particularly timely topic with the election this year and in general in this environment. So we're very glad to have Jacob Ware and Bruce Hoffman here tonight to talk to us about it. It's for those of you who work on terrorism issues and counterinsurgency issues, the person immediately to my left needs no introduction, but I will introduce him, and it is an inappropriately long bio, but I will give it anyway. This is Bruce Hoffman, who's been working on insurgency and terrorism for about 50 years, although he is only 55, so he started very young. He's a professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. He's a senior fellow for counterterrorism and homeland security at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's a senior fellow at the U.S. military's Combating Terrorism Center. He's also was on the 9/11 Review Commission and is on a commission now to combat anti-Semitism for Virginia State. He's a scholar in residence for the CIA, and he's been a recipient of the U.S. intelligence community SEAL Medallion, which is the highest level that a civilian can get from the intelligence community. He's, of course, one of the authors of today's book, the seminal work on counterterrorism, Inside Terrorism, which has like 5 editions at this point. Many,
but getting there.
And Anonymous Soldiers, the Struggle for Israel, 1917 to 1947. And a very distinguished colleague as well to his left, Jacob Ware, who's been a massively meteorically rising scholar in the field too. He is a research fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and an adjunct at Georgetown University as well. He's on the editorial board of Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, as well as the Irregular War Initiative at the Modern War Institute at West Point. And the two of them have done a number of collaborations together leading up to this book that really is, I think, the culmination of the research you've been doing for a couple of years. So I thought I would turn it over to you initially to give some remarks, and then I know we have a student who will kick off some questions for us, and then we'll get to some audience questions, if that sounds like a good way to go.
Yeah,
okay.
That's fine. Thank you so much, Tricia, firstly for inviting us, and secondly for the very kind introduction. But you left out the most important part. I was on your dissertation committee.
That's true. So he is older than 55.
Well, and my co-author is 41 years younger than me. So if you can be stumped by math problems and working out my age. Well, we're delighted to be here. We've written this book, God, Guns, and Sedition. I'll tell you a bit about how and why we started writing it, and a little bit about the book, and then I'll turn it over to Jacob, who will talk about some of the key themes and tease out some of the policy recommendations, or maybe we'll both do that together. But you can start, and then we'll open it up. So we began this book in April 2020, about 3 weeks into the COVID pandemic lockdown. And we started it for a few reasons. Firstly, both Jacob and I were very alarmed how literally within days of the lockdown, the first anti-Semitic tropes and memes began to appear on social media, claiming that this was part of some vast global Jewish conspiracy designed so that Israel could invent a vaccine and therefore the Jews could profit from it. And then we noticed within days of that, the aperture of hate had widened and now was targeting Asians and Asian Americans and blaming them for having brought the COVID virus to the United States. And then it widened even further to immigrants, and also with a call on white supremacist and neo-Nazi and other types of social media feeds that when you get infected with COVID, what you should do is go to a local pharmacy or supermarket, because those are the only places that in essence were open, and cough on a minority or cough on a person of color and get them ill as well. And we thought that this was enormously troubling. And also for me, being the older of the two, it was very reminiscent of the early 1980s. In fact, when I started my career as an analyst 43 years ago, just to confound you further with numbers, my first account was actually violent far-right extremism. It started focusing in Europe, but then had migrated to the United States because it was very clearly a problem here. And I had focused on it throughout the 1980s and the 1990s. But then after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, like every other terrorism analyst, I was laser focused on Salafi jihadi terrorism, in particular Al-Qaeda and subsequently ISIS. But having been familiar with that period, I thought there was tremendous resonance or familiarity. In 2020, one could even say now, as in the early 1980s, the United States had just finished a decades-long and not terribly successful overseas military expedition that had undermined confidence in elected leadership and also in the government. So that was, especially at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, that was something that was very widespread. Secondly, there were all kinds of fears about what COVID would do to the economy. And this also reminded me of the early 1980s when the United States was in a somewhat precarious position with 17 and 18% inflation annually, which, 3 times what it is today. And that was a driving factor in the reemergence of this movement. And then thirdly was the flashpoint now as then immigration. Less to do in the early 1980s with immigrants coming from south of the border and everything to do with Vietnamese boat people who had come to the United States after the US withdrew from Indochina. And there was an individual who appears throughout our book named Louis Beam, a Vietnam War veteran, did 2 tours in Vietnam as a helicopter door gunner, returned to the United States, very disillusioned, also suffering from PTSD, and became the Grand Dragon of the Texas Ku Klux Klan, and actually led this charge against the Vietnamese shrimpers and fishermen fishing for other things in Galveston and Port Arthur, amongst other places. And what I remembered back then, I should say, and what we were noticing in 2020 was that the movement had this perennially expansive outlook. In other words, like all terrorist movements that have to constantly, as a famous metaphor, at least my favorite metaphor from Inside Terrorism, that they have to, one of my other books, that they have to constantly move forward to survive. All terrorist groups are constantly searching for new constituencies and to broaden their demographic. And that was the key to understanding the movement in the 1980s, is that it had transitioned from the stereotypical hate, racist, anti-Semitic, xenophobic, anti-Catholic type of groups, basically the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party, wearing white sheets and conical hats and masks or brown shirts and Sam Brown belts. Now they were different. They were wearing suits, for example. They were also espousing causes that went well beyond simple hatred and intolerance. There was widespread opposition to paying taxes, to paying state and federal taxes. There was a belief that there was no legitimate government above the county level and that the local sheriff was the highest elected official that anybody had to listen to. There was militant opposition to Roe versus Wade and to legalized abortion in the United States that was turned into violence, in fact, not just opposition. But bombing of abortion clinics, assassination of doctors and nurses and security guards. There was a zealous embrace of the Second Amendment. And also in the 1980s, what you saw that hadn't existed in the past was a very salient seditious or anti-government extremist attitude, whereby they were calling the United States government ZOG, Z-O-G, for Zionist occupation government. And that basically is the God part of the title. Completely accidentally, it turns out that the title maps the 3 major eras of the book. So the God part is because the movement back then had a very salient or even prominent religious or theological dimensions. Many of the leaders of the white supremacist movement back then prefaced their names with titles like pastor or Reverend Richard Gerd Butler, who was the founder and head of the Aryan Nations, Pastor Robert Miles, who was the head of a Michigan variant of that, the Reverend Pete Peters, and so on. So there were lots of religious influences. And that existed through most of the decade. But then in 1988, there was a seminal development that affects the movement in 2 respects. 14 white supremacists are indicted on charges of seditious conspiracy, perhaps the hardest criminal charge to prove in the United States, and which is why the conviction in recent years of almost 24 Proud Boys and Oath Keepers is so enormously significant. Very difficult charge to prove, and the government failed to do so in Fort Smith, Arkansas in 1988, and the 14 white supremacists were acquitted. And this had a two-pronged effect on the movement. Firstly, they decided that had the government been successful, they would have completely decapitated the movement. So for that reason, they decided to move to, in the vernacular of the 21st century, flatter, more linear, more networked type of organization, basically to go from the hierarchical or pyramidal terrorist organizations with a command and control structure that was constantly being infiltrated by federal agents or betrayed by confidential informants. They would devolve to something today we call lone wolf or lone actor tactics, or lone actor or lone wolf strategy, to what they call then leaderless resistance. And actually Louis Beam, again, figures very prominently. He was the foremost exponent of that. Secondly, the movement also decided it had to grow in order to survive. And that's the guns part of the title, because right around the end of the 1980s, something called the militia groups rather, were emerging. And this movement tapped into the wellspring of the militia movements, which was also a certain apocalyptic and survivalist element, which also still had some religious connotations to it. But more than anything else, it was zealous opposition to any attempt to infringe upon the Second Amendment. And this fear was well-founded, because the administration of President Bill Clinton was actually quite aggressive and quite effective in reining in Second Amendment rights and imposing restrictions on the purchase of firearms. And in fact, there was a decade-long ban on assault rifles that Congress passed, and that expired in the mid-2000s with the consequences that we're all only too familiar with. So that's the guns part, and that's where the leaderless resistance and the militant opposition to any imposition of gun controls converges in the climactic terrorist act of the 1990s. In fact, the most lethal terrorist incident in the history of the United States until the September 11th, 2001 attack. So that was the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Office Building in Oklahoma City that killed 168 persons. And this was carried out by a U.S. Army veteran named Timothy McVeigh, who was completely borrowing this lone wolf or lone actor strategy. He had enlisted two former Army buddies, two friends who he had served with in the Army, I guess is the right way to put it. One of them actually peeled off, but the other, Terry Nichols, stayed with him until the end. And it was basically two persons that killed 168 American citizens, including, as some of you may recall, right in the path of the blast was the America's Daycare Center, and killed, I believe it was 17 children, infants, toddlers. Just absolutely horrible. Anybody should say too, if you ever, Oklahoma City is actually a very nice place. And if you ever go there, the Cowboy Museum or Cowboy Hall of Fame is great, but the 9/11 Memorial, the Oklahoma City Memorial and Museum is just amazing. And I'm actually an advisor to the 9/11 Museum, but I find the Oklahoma City one even more searing, because this was Americans doing this to other Americans. So anyway, Timothy McVeigh is an exemplar of the leaderless resistance of this militant opposition to gun control. I'm sure this will come up in discussion, but he was a devotee of a dystopian novel called The Turner Diaries, which has been used as a blueprint as Life Imitates Art, a terrorist group that was actually called The Order, emulates the fictional version of The Order. McVeigh was so enamored of this book that when he was in the Army, when he had downtime and was off duty from Fort Riley, Kansas, he would travel around the Midwest selling the Turner Diaries at gun shows. When he was arrested about an hour after the Murrah Building blast by an Oklahoma State trooper, he had a folder next to him, and inside that folder were pages of the Turner Diaries that had been cut out and highlighted and underlined. That's how obsessed he was with this novel. So the FBI, of course, cracks down on this movement, and the movement basically disappears, and then, of course, is superseded by 9/11. But then in 2008, there are two developments. One is the worst recession or economic crisis the United States has experienced since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And secondly, the viable presidential candidacy of the first African American, Barack Obama, who's actually given Secret Service protection earlier than any other presidential candidate in history because of the volume of threats directed against him. And of course, once he's elected, the threats don't abate. Also, right around 2008 is when Facebook and social media is making its appearance. And what Jacob and I chronicle in the book as part of this historical trajectory is how social media completely empowers and almost weaponizes this movement. Whereas in the 1980s and 90s, there were people who believed in these poisonous ideologies and pursued all their seditious, racist, anti-Semitic, and so on ideas. They were still geographically fairly dispersed and fairly disparate. But the I don't have to tell any of you this, social media provides a connectivity and a networking that, transcends time and space. And it was weaponized and used by the violent far right to breathe new life into this movement and to become as consequential as they have become. And of course, in 2015, you have the horrific attack at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston that claims the lives of 9 people. And then in succeeding years, you have the attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018. And then the attack on a Walmart in El Paso, Texas in 2019. And then the attack on the Tops grocery store in an African-American community in Buffalo in 2022. I mean, this is just a litany of some of them. And then, of course, when Jacob and I started writing the book, in April 2020, we could have no idea that 15 or 16 months later, the events of January 6, 2021 would unfold. And that, of course, gave the book greater relevance and urgency. And really, what the book shows is how January 6, 2021 was not an aberration, but was a logical waypoint on this trajectory, on this path of sedition and anti-government extremism. Jacob.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce, Tricia. Thank you so much, everybody, for having me here. It's a real honor. So I think our book really has two main accomplishments, I would say. One is that historical narrative and trajectory that Bruce laid out. I think the other one is some of the themes that we're able to kind of pull out. The themes, the trends in the movement over the past 40 years, but really all the way back to the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. And I'm going to touch on some of those because I think, when we get to our final chapter, which is the longest one, which is policy recommendations, our policy recommendations are actually going to respond to those themes, as opposed to kind of the stories and the histories, which are equally important. So I'm going to pull out some of those themes and happy to expand on them and also talk about how we try to respond in the Q&A. But the first trend, the first theme that I think is essential to recognize is communications and the role of communications. Now, Bruce already laid out that the far right have actually always been cutting edge pioneers in communications. But we often get asked kind of what is the element that has, or what is the unique part that has given this movement so much energy over the past decade? And I think you can't look at that, or you can't try to answer that question without talking about social media. Social media has accelerated ideology, and it's accelerated that leaderless resistance strategy. It's given them networks. It's allowed them to cooperate where they want to. It's allowed them to transcend borders and ideological silos. And I think this is a particularly important conclusion as we sit on the precipice of a new generation in communications technology with generative AI and deepfakes, for example, which are going to be, we believe, used by this movement in innovative ways, because they've always been innovative with technology, whether it's internet forums or social media or live streams. They are always on the cutting edge, finding ways to advance their own radicalization and recruitment, and of course, operations and tactics as well. So communications is a big theme. The second one I think that is important and related to that is tactics and targeting. Now, we've seen a shift away from the complex kind of explosive attacks that we saw at Oklahoma City and also the following year at Atlanta Centennial Park, towards a particularly American form of violence, that is the mass shooting. And when you look across the cases, these days especially, we are seeing a model emerge, including a lone actor, so operating in that leaderless resistance framework, who's radicalized on social media, but they are conducting mass shootings, often targeting soft targets, whether that's a place of worship like at Charleston, or another kind of community center in some kind of ethnic or racial enclave like Buffalo. I think that's related to leaderless resistance and social media, right? Because as kind of coordination has dissipated, and as actors are operating on their own more, perhaps they are younger, perhaps they have less training, that more crude and easy to access attack becomes more popular. So that's why we're seeing these mass shootings. And we can talk about what differentiates the kind of incident that we write about in the book, so a far right terrorist attack, from other kinds of mass shooting incidents here in the United States, because there are important distinctions. The third theme that we pull out and try to respond to is the lack of legal tools that the US government has to combat domestic terrorism. Now, Tricia, I'm sure will know well that in the international terrorism space, the government has the formidable 18 USC 2339B.
Nice.
Been working on that, which is the Material Support to a Foreign Terrorist Organization statute. Now that means something, right? So FTO's State Department Foreign Terrorist Organization designation. So a lot of the groups that you'll all have heard of, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, those are designated foreign terrorist organizations, which means if a US citizen provides material support to that group, they can be charged for that. And material support is defined very broadly. It can include money, propaganda, violence, travel. So you can provide yourself as material support. And it's a great tool. So in the ISIS FTO cases, averaged about 13 and a half years prison sentences, material support to a foreign terrorist organization. We don't have a charge like that in the domestic space. It doesn't exist, for some good reasons, some bad ones. And there's two real issues with that. One is optics. So it's a problem that the US government can charge terrorists of a different religion, often a different race, as terrorists in the legal system. But the white supremacist murderers are not charged as terrorists at the federal level. Sometimes there's a state charge like the Buffalo shooting. So that's one. But the bigger issue actually is sentencing equity and recidivism. So I think the big example here is an individual by the name of Brandon Russell, who in 2015, 2016, 2017, around there, founded a neo-Nazi organization called the Atomwaffen Division. Brandon was arrested around that time for stockpiling explosives. Local law enforcement believed he was planning an attack. And he was sentenced for explosive charges and I think a weapons of mass destruction charge to about 5 years in prison. So compare that, first of all, to the 13 and a half years in the ISIS cases. Brandon was actually released early, and last February was rearrested for a plot to blow up power stations around Baltimore. He was going to black out the city, try to create a race war that way. So clearly somebody who did not have sufficient deterrence from his contact with the justice system. We actually saw a similar case, I think, where this problem reemerged just the other day, where our mutual friend from the University of Nebraska, Omaha, Seamus Hughes, reported on a case down by the southern border where an individual had been in contact with law enforcement. They knew he was plotting an attack on Border Patrol, right? He had spoken about how he was amassing explosives, and he actually had specifically threatened to be a sniper across the border, right? He felt his skill set was being a sniper. None of that's a crime to say that stuff. So the government eventually managed to cajole him into selling them a unregistered silencer. And that was how they managed to get him off the streets, which is, how the government often has to handle these cases, because there is no domestic terrorism charge. Now, if this individual had been speaking this way and planning an attack on behalf of the Islamic State, that would have been material support to a foreign terrorist organization. He would have had that 20-year sentence. So that's the third theme. The fourth one is, I think, a more difficult one to speak of, a more controversial one for sure, and that is the personal histories of some of these extremists. So we have seen, especially in the recent cases over the past decade or so, we've seen a range of what we call personal vulnerabilities, personal factors, susceptibilities to radicalization that are reemerging in a lot of these cases. So the big one, I think, first of all, is youth. So we're seeing extremist terrorists get younger. Adam Woff individual is kind of a poster child for that. We're seeing rising levels of mental health issues, histories of being bullied, histories of violence in the home, sometimes histories of parental suicide. And those are all really difficult things. So Adam Woff Division, again, is another effective case study. So Brandon founded the group, and in the years they were active, they were responsible for 5 murders inspired by white supremacy and neo-Nazism. 1 in Virginia, 1 in California, 2 in Virginia, 1 in California, and then 2 in Florida. When you look at the 3 killers responsible for those murders, as well as the founder, Brandon, all 4 of those individuals have autism spectrum disorder and at least 1 other mental illness. That's a really important conclusion, because that was a prominent group that was recruiting people online, killing people, possibly plotting more ambitious terrorist attacks, and youth and mental illness were playing a huge role in the social media space. So that's one that I think is we're still trying to approach what that really means and how you would kind of deal with that kind of issue, but certainly something that's coming up in the cases. We'll get more controversial, actually, because the 5th theme is the relationship that this movement has with the United States military, which is kind of shocking as you're actually reading through the book, which is just over there for sale at the lovely American University campus store, by the way. It's kind of shocking reading through how many of those cases of military. So Bruce already mentioned Timothy McVeigh, the individual who conducted the bombing the following year at the Atlanta Olympic Park, was a U.S. Army veteran. He'd actually entered the military specifically for the training. Now, so if you think there are 3 ways that somebody with a military background can radicalize into extremism, right? They can radicalize before their service, like Eric Rudolph did, and they can enter the military for training, weapons expertise, sometimes to steal weapons, to radicalize and recruit, communications expertise, insurgency expertise. So that's one. You can have people who radicalize inside the military as active duty soldiers, and then you can have people who radicalize as veterans, sometimes decades later. Now, in the spirit of critiquing our own work, so Bruce and I find in our book that overwhelmingly we're talking about the first and the third categories. So people who enter the military as white supremacists or anti-government extremists for the recruitment and training, or people who are veterans like Timothy McVeigh and conduct attacks. We find that middle portion is actually a lot less common. And the reason that matters is because the Biden administration's focus in this space has been on that middle category. It's been on those active duty soldiers through things like the stand down, which was when everybody in the military was going to talk about extremism, which proved very unpopular, very ineffective. So that's what we've been saying at these talks. But I would say an awful lot of these book talks, including on Monday, people have come up to us and said it's active duty as well. And they are, people in the military or people who've come out or people who spend a lot of time in military communities who basically say it's not that simple. It's also the active duty that's a problem. So, and that's been quite, I think, sobering and shocking to see that even when we try to take a somewhat optimistic line on this topic, people have come and corrected us on that. So it is a theme. Brandon Russell, again, I've mentioned him on 3 of these themes now. Another person who entered the National Guard for the training and the weapons expertise. The last theme I'll mention, and it's possibly the most important one given where we are as a country right now, is the interaction that this movement has with national politics, especially elections. When you look at the last 3 new presidents, so President Obama, President Trump, and President Biden, all 3 of their inaugurations and administrations have led to significant spikes in the movement, both ideologically and also tactically. Bruce mentioned the spike after Obama's candidacy and election Obviously, President Trump's election leads to a rise in white supremacist violence and anti-government extremism. We chronicle a few events that happened early in his administration with individuals specifically linking their violence to his candidacy. But then in August that year, 2017, we of course have Charlottesville, which is kind of a momentous moment for the movement where they feel that they get top cover from the presidency. And then President Biden, of course, his election leads to a huge spike in election denialism, anti-government extremism, culminating at January 6th. Why does that matter so much this year? Because, of course, we're entering a particularly fractious election year with many of the same dynamics we've seen over the past, in the previous national presidential election, but a bit more intense this time, I think, and a bit of a longer period. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for violence this year, I fear, whether it's primaries, conventions, campaigning, right? And Nikki Haley there was news reporting yesterday that Nikki Haley has requested Secret Service protection. The election itself, mail-in election, vote counting, news organizations that report on them, all the ceremonial dates leading up to inauguration day itself, and then all the court dates, right, which are an extra kind of an extra powder keg. So I fear, unfortunately, that the findings of our book are going to be relevant this year. And, I do fear that the recommendations that we make, which I'll turn over to Bruce, it's hard to see how any of them would activate fast enough for them to be effective. Now, Bruce, you may disagree, but fire away.
No, there are things that we disagreed about when writing the book, but this isn't one of them. Very briefly, so we can turn it over to Q&A. So as Jacob said, the largest chapter of the book is on the policy recommendations, and we divide them into 3 categories. It also assumes a perfect world and a very effective and cooperative and nonpartisan Congress, but be that as it may. That was also going into writing those policy recommendations. We tried to make them as practical and as nonpartisan as possible, but I mean, it's almost impossible in this day and age in any event. One of them is, so anyway, there's 3 different categories. Things that we can implement now that would have an immediate effect of strengthening the regulatory framework. And that, for instance, there's many recommendations, but is something that Jacob already mentioned in passing, enactment of a domestic terrorism law, in part to bring greater equity to sentencing, also empower the Justice Department, the FBI, to actually compile statistics on terrorism in the United States. I think it would also have a benefit of getting away from, terrorism has always been a very tortured and debated and contentious term, but it would, to me, I'll just come out and say it, it's absolutely stunning that you have persons convicted in federal court of crimes who are called hostages. They're not hostages, they're convicts, but if we call them terrorists. The one thing, even though everybody disagrees on what terrorism should be defined as, everybody does agree it's a negative term. So I think that would be very helpful to call it what it is. And also it would bring equity to sentencing, as I said, which I think is enormously important. And also, I think we could do it in such a way, in such a way that it would not empower would-be or future authoritarian presidents. New York state law, for example, has a terrorism crime statute, and basically it has nothing to do with First Amendment rights. It's very clear. It's when you've blown past the First Amendment and you've actually killed at least one person and injured 4 others. So we think it could be something like that. We also talk about measures that could be implemented now that would begin to have a very positive effect in the medium or intermediate next 5 to 10 years. And things like this would be enhancing and improving digital and media literacy, which the Biden administration has already embarked upon. I suppose reform of Section 230, I should have mentioned that, is in the first category. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act frees social media and tech companies from any liability for the content on their platforms. And we argue that that should be changed because the law has not kept pace with technological developments. So in the medium term, though, we talk about things that would begin to heal and repair civil society. So the digital and media literacy that the Biden administration has embarked upon and featured, but needs to be done on a much more expansive basis and overseen by the Department of Education, and something that should be part of social studies or civics curricula. Things like bringing, somewhat counterintuitively, bringing broadband to rural areas. I mean, that's one of the secrets of the United States, that in urban metropolitan areas, only about 1.5% of the population does not have access to broadband. In the rest of America, it's about 25%. And this came home very sharply to myself, and probably to you too, when we were in the midst of the COVID lockdown and we had to do virtual instruction. And I had students, for instance, in Tennessee that had to drive 40 miles to go to a Starbucks to get on Wi-Fi, because, we all in Washington assumed everybody has access to Zoom and everybody can jump on, these lectures. And you found out that people with dial-up modems, I mean, if you've seen the film, You've Got Mail, I mean, that film is 25 or 26 years old. There's still people that are relying on that technology. And it reminded me of during the 1920s when the Ku Klux Klan was extremely powerful. It was one of these groups that also had looked to expand beyond, in order to grow, its narrow constituency of racists and individuals determined to re-enslave freed people throughout the South. The Klan of the 20th century had broadened its hate to include Jews, Catholics, and Asians, and in fact was so powerful and so influential that it not only had a leading role in both the Republican and Democratic presidential conventions in 1924, but then succeeded in getting an immigration bill passed that year that remained in force for another 41 years and was not repealed until 1965. We talk about, and the Klan back then was very anti-science, anti-expertise, anti-urban elites, even though amazingly the Klan had more members north of the Mason-Dixon line in the 20s than it did in the South. In fact, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and Ohio had the largest Klan memberships. But nonetheless, they had this suspicion of elites and the suspicion of science, which of course was, all these things had come together in 2020 as well, and embarked us on the book. So we felt that this would counter that there's an us versus them, and that the cities or either coasts of the United States are privileged with broadband and bring it to the population. I mean, we also talk about classical countering violent extremism programs that also address mental health and involve communities, not so much the government. And then finally, in the final category, we believe that these things would lead, or hopefully lead, to a generational change that would restore national unity, and that would really rebuild the fractured political environment that everybody laments about now, but we seem to be in a stasis. But it would only be through the immediate changes and the medium-term changes that could actually produce the change that we think is so important to our country now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. It's very sobering. It reminds me of a Washington Post lead today. I was actually just talking about it in class. When you're giving that overview and the comparison from the 1980s, it was history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And I couldn't help but think that as you were walking through that. And as a person who really came into the counterterrorism field right after 9/11, I think that's also that context maybe sometimes gets lost among the experts on this topic. Here in the School of Public Affairs, we have a terrorism and homeland security master's program and concentration. And so we have a lot of students who are increasingly interested in these topics. So to kick off our Q&A, I invited one of our excellent grad students, Zachary Trebelak, who's graduating from our master's program this year, to start us off with some questions and then lead us into moderation.
Thank you, Dr. Bacon, and thank you both for being here tonight. I've already read your book. It's an incredible piece of work and incredibly timely as well, especially with the election year. One question that I had, especially regarding the last chapter, is your analysis emphasizes the international dimension of extremist movements facilitated by social media. So how do you envision international collaboration and coordination in combating online extremism while respecting diverse legal frameworks and cultural sensitivities?
That's a great question. It kind of gets to the heart of so many issues in the book. Well, certainly the EU is much stricter about data protection and privacy than the United States is. I mean, it doesn't have those countries don't have First Amendment rights enshrined in the Constitution like we do. And you're right to talk about the international dimension, because this movement, that was one thing I left out in the 1980s, was also very much forward-looking and outward-looking, and actually cultivated a transnational presence. And in fact, in my view, there are two key or foundational changes in terrorism in the 21st century that have really changed the nature of terrorism. One of which I already talked about, that's the lone wolf and the lone actor phenomena. And the other is radicalization and recruitment over digital media. Now, the prevailing assumption or the conventional wisdom is that both of those originated in the Middle East or South Asia with groups like Al-Qaeda, or even more prominently, ISIS. But as I said earlier, leaderless resistance is a strategy that Louis Beam was advocating in the early 1980s and then kind of refurbished it in 1992. But he also took the movement in a very different direction at a time when, firstly, wiretaps and the typical or traditional modes of surveillance by federal law enforcement were undermining these groups. And also when these groups, in order to affect this international bonding, were sending lots of hate mail from the United States to Canada and what was then West Germany in particular. And what would happen is federal postal inspectors would then come and arrest them. So it was kind of like Al Capone being arrested for tax evasion when he'd done so many other bad things. Before these guys could even commit acts of terrorism, they were being imprisoned on federal mail charges. So Beam came up with the idea of using what were comparatively very simple computers. I mean, an Apple II Plus computer in 1983 had about 48K memory, which is probably a numeral or a letter on a PowerPoint slide today. And he used modems. But the government had no idea about these new desktop computers and things. And Beam would actually, provide tutorials to people. So some of our prejudice is that, this particular category of terrorism may not be terribly sophisticated, but they were the ones who introduced, firstly, what has become a phenomenon of terrorism today, lone wolf or lone actor terrorism 40 years ago, and also radicalization and recruitment on digital media. So they've always been outward looking. And now we're in a really difficult, if not invidious position, where the United States is seen as an exporter of this poisonous ideology, and that the United States is not doing enough to curtail it. Now, after September 11th, 2001, the United States and other countries called out places like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan for not doing enough to counter the spread of a different ideology from their countries, and pressed them to take more action domestically against clerics and others who were advocating what was seen as a poisonous and disabling ideology. Well, our closest European allies accuse the United States now of doing the same thing. And when you think about it, the United States historically has the warmest, the best ties with Canada. I mean, it's the largest open border probably in the history of mankind. We have mostly the same language, the same culture, free trade. Canada, our closest ally, has designated 5 U.S. groups and 1 individual. Well, 5 U.S. groups as foreign terrorist organizations and 1 individual as a foreign terrorist. Great Britain has designated 2, and Jacob mentioned one of them, Zademoffen, as a terrorist organization. Australia has designated 1. So think about it too. There's something called the Five Eyes, which is 5 English language speaking countries: Canada, United Kingdom, Australia, United States, and New Zealand, that have such close relations and such a commonality of democracy and of governance and of approach to the world, that there's really an unprecedented sharing of intelligence. So take out the United States from the 5, and then you just have Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. New Zealand is not designated other groups. But 3 of the 5 Five Eyes, or 3 of the 4 without the United States, have designated American-based groups as terrorist organizations. I mean, this shows that there's a real problem, and that the United States has to lead the way in doing more, and really hasn't. One thing we point to in the book that we think is encouraging and provides a model was a white paper that the British government released in 2019. It was the Home Office and the Ministry of Culture, Sport, and Digital Media, and it was called the Online Harms White Paper, which lays out the responsibilities that governments have to its citizens to keep them safe in a digital space. It's not just political extremism, but that's part of it. It's harassment, bullying, body shaming, obviously racism, anti-Semitism, any kind of intolerance, bullying as well, trafficking in images of children, and so on. And it still hasn't been enacted into law, but it does provide a blueprint. And at least Britain is moving in that direction. We're not even close to having that discussion.
Thank you. I've got one more question, and then we'll continue with everyone else. This one's for Professor Ware. You talked particularly about vulnerable populations, specifically youth, and even more particular individuals on the autism spectrum. From my understanding, individuals on the autism spectrum they're not just associated with mass shootings, or they're not just the perpetrators, but they're also the perpetrators of school shootings as well. Where do you see the academic literature going in terms of trying to better understand how to prosecute and try to thwart some of these activities that these particular individuals might be conducting?
It's an excellent question, and as I said earlier, it's a really tough one to try to approach. There's four reasons really why this is so difficult. One is people think if you're talking about autism spectrum disorder or other mental health issues, you are distracting from guns, like the fact that the guns are the cause. Two is people think you're distracted from ideology, so you're excusing white supremacy by saying, oh, it's not their fault. Three is stigmatizing, which is I think a really important one. And four is this view that it's disrespectful to victims of violence to talk about suffering or difficulties also endured by the perpetrator. And those are all important. I think my counter argument is we are seeing this reemerge again and again in the data, and at some point we have to engage with that by, I think, not thinking of it as counterterrorism, but thinking of something like this, and bullying is another huge one. History is being bullied as one possible factor in a range of vulnerabilities that might make somebody more susceptible to being radicalized. So how do you handle that? Well, I think it's, Bruce and I talk about CVE programming, countering violent extremism programming, that would be particularly targeted or particularly targeted to, young men on social media, for example. I think one of the issues that we're facing is that social media is now so powerful. It's the front line in radicalization and extremism, that particularly vulnerable people, there used to be guardrails you could erect around those children. So whether that was parents, counselors, teachers, coaches, church, authorities, those have been completely eroded. And social media can just go straight through them into a vulnerable person's bedroom or living room, and that, I think, is where we have to find a way to fight back. So both in that kind of traditional CVE mental health programming, anti-bullying initiatives, trying to build resilience against radicalization, but also trying to make social media a healthier, more productive space for somebody who might require some extra support. To give you one example of what this looks like when the system really kind of breaks, there was a shooting that occurred in October 2022 in Slovakia, Bratislava, where a person had murdered two people outside a local gay bar. I can't remember if he had a mental health diagnosis, but he certainly had depression and suicidal ideation. And he tells this story of the day where he was going to go and commit suicide. And he was walking on the train tracks waiting for a train to come along, and he had this realization, and he writes about it in his manifesto. He says, he kind of has this revelation where he says, what am I doing? I'm the most dangerous person in the world. I can do whatever I want for my movement. And he was 18 when he conducted his attack. At some point in that person's journey, there needed to be an intervention that wasn't forthcoming. So he was able to answer his own personal grievances, suffering, pain with hateful ideology, and then murdered people on behalf of it. That's, I think, a good example of where we need to be designing or scaling some better kind of countermeasures against specifically that kind of story. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please introduce yourself. Zachary comes around.
Hi, thank you both for coming tonight. I'm Josie. I work with Dr. Bacon on some research all around ISK and then separately do some Al-Shabaab research as well. My question is related a little bit towards Zach's first question about how organizations in the US and international organizations of different ideologies exchange tactics or communication styles, or maybe don't specifically take inspiration from each other around the way that they're interacting, both within the organization and conducting attacks externally.
And maybe I could add to that whether they're learning from other movements. Do you see the far right learning from
Yeah.
tactics and targets
Yeah, that exactly.
from other movements?
Absolutely. I mean, all terrorists, all effective terrorists learn from one another. I mean, the ones who don't learn from one another don't stay around very long. And this goes back even to September 12th or 13th, 2001, when I was just making that transition from following violent far-right extremism to Salafi jihadi extremism. And I saw on what was the very primitive forms of the internet back then, panegyrics to bin Laden and white supremacists in the United States calling for a quote unquote Christian jihad and saying, we've got to imitate these guys, we've got to follow them. Think about when the United States left Afghanistan in August 2021. The first two groups actually to congratulate the Taliban were Hezbollah and Hamas, very different ideologies. And the third was the Proud Boys, who said persistence and perseverance, just like the Taliban says, is how you can confront even superpowers. And they're saying if they can do that in Afghanistan to the United States, think what we can do here, given how well armed we are. Certainly, I would argue there's been this symbiosis or synergy between the far right and groups in the Middle East, without any doubt. And I think one of the most worrying phenomena is what we've seen really in recent years is this reveling in ultra-violence, is where I'm stealing your thunder, I'm sorry, but there was an incident, because Jacob often is the one who mentions this, but there was an incident just last week when an individual outside of Philadelphia murdered his father, who was a federal government employee, because of course the deep state is amongst the many conspiratorial factions that is active, and beheaded him, put his head in a baggie, and then put a video up on YouTube that was up for 6 hours. Is that right? I mean, that's right out of ISIS, right? I mean, it's right out of ISIS, and the fact that it stayed online for so long shows how little progress there've been. I mean, there was some respect for not much for the baddies of James Foley and Steve Satloff and Peter Kasich and two Britons and others. But yeah, they absolutely learn from one another. And even now you see this. I mean, there was someone, for instance, in Northern Virginia in 2018 who was arrested and tried. He was actually a transit police officer. And it's what the FBI calls was it salad bar ideologies or fringe fluidity or, basically ideology hopping, where he was arrested for providing material support to ISIS, but he was also a devotee of Osama bin Laden and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, but also of Adolf Hitler. And there's photographs of him, some photographs wearing a kufiya and a jalabiya, and other photographs of him wearing a Waffen SS uniform of the Afrika Korps. So yeah, this is becoming much more common.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Tolu Odukoya. I'm a PhD student, but I was Dr. Bacon's master's student a few years ago, and she's on my committee now. This was amazing. I can't wait to read the book. I have 2 questions, and I'm going to try and say them as fast as possible. So the first one is, how much of your research, how much in your research were you able to connect bias in policing that already exists with the failure to prosecute the cases? So for example, when the FBI was doing the CVE movement for Salafist recruiting in the US, there was a disproportionate treatment of white versus non-white individuals who came in contact or interacted with terrorism. And so that kind of bias where you look at a white kid as like, oh, he could be my son and he's just young and he doesn't know what he's doing in policing and how that affects dealing with this situation. And then second question is, for the CVE movement that you were thinking about, how much of that do you think, or would you advise to involve actually helping the families deal with autism? Because sometimes the bullying is not coming from school, it's coming from your own family where they're like, pull your boots up, men don't act like this, men don't cry. And if your community is the one bullying you and telling you your behavior is weird, then really there's nowhere else to go to change, and the internet is your only resource.
I'm not asking easy questions. Jacob's ready to flee these questions.
Well, I'll try the police one. Your question, this is more certainly the part of the books that Jacob wrote, so I'm going to definitely leave him with those. He accused me yesterday of throwing him under the bus, but I don't think that's quite the case. I mean, the book had to be very narrowly scoped. I mean, firstly, the publisher didn't want a very large book because they just don't sell, as I've learned from painful experience. And also, I mean, we really tried to focus on the terrorism aspect, and what you're pointing out with the police is entirely valid, but it was one of the sociological dimensions, neither of us are sociologists or criminologists, that we really didn't get into. But I mean, what we do focus on is how it's not just bias in the police, but there are many people, many police officers who are members of these groups or are sympathetic to them, which of course is highly problematic. So it's not just the veterans or active members of the service that Jacob was describing earlier, but it's also a real problem with law enforcement. And there's an irony here because, well, firstly, there's no federal statistics that I can cite. I have to go to a non-governmental organization because there's no terrorism in the US, so there's no terrorism statute, no terrorists either. But the Anti-Defamation League, for the past decade, or a bit more, has tracked that the leading targets of violent far-right extremists are invariably police officers and government officials, but police in particular. And of course, there's a sovereign citizens movement that firstly knows no boundaries in terms of religion, in terms of race, in terms of culture or ethnicity, that is united in believing, again, that there's no legal authority above a very local level, and that any police officer trying to do anything, even giving a speeding ticket, is violating their constitutional rights, that has used violence against them. So this is an enormous problem. And again, it was the Anti-Defamation League that showed how there were, I think this was a very low figure in any event, but several thousand members of Oath Keepers and 3%ers roles were in fact police officers. So it's not just, local police, it's state police and it's federal police as well. And this is of course a real problem when it comes to whether we can count on law enforcement. And one would have thought that the events of January 6th, when so many US Capitol police officers and DC Metro police officers were wantonly assaulted in the worst possible ways and have testified about it, and yet their testimony falls on dead ears. I mean, that should have woken anyone to this threat. So it's one of those things that we identify and recognize and say there has to be much more action on. In this environment, it's very difficult, but you're absolutely right. It's extremely worrisome.
Those are two just absolutely phenomenal questions. On the first one, I don't know. I do think bias definitely contributes to a failure to prepare. Like January 6th, there was a grave failure to prepare. And I think it's actually not an intelligence failure. I think that's a term that gets thrown around a lot. It's not an intelligence failure. We had the intelligence. People who track the online spaces a lot closer than Bruce and I do say that the alarms were going off everywhere. We just didn't prepare correctly. Was that because you think these white guys won't actually do anything. And what does that preparation look like if this is the Islamic State, or if this is Black Lives Matter preparing for, using that volume of intelligence? So there I agree with you. The prosecution question, I just don't know. It's a really good one. On the second one, it's an interesting question. I'm going to have to reflect on that. I'll be honest with you and say that in the cases that I can think of off the top of my head, I don't think families have played a big role in advancing the radicalization. I'm trying to think. My sources on this would be the manifestos themselves, which can be a lie, and family members, like a sister or a parent of an extremist, who say that we tried everything. They were gripped by this cancer, and we could do nothing. Some of the manifestos I can think of, like one that relates to a shooting at a synagogue in Poway, in California in April 2019, he actually had written a Q&A in his manifesto. At one point he said, "Did your parents teach you this?" And he said, "No, I wish they're sleeping," basically. So it's a really good question. I know of somebody who's been targeted in a hate crime seriously, and one of the perpetrators was 13 years old, and when the police went and knocked on the door, the parents were furious. That's a great situation, right? If that happens, if you can kind of involve the parents and the parents can kind of take care of the situation. CVE needs to involve parents and community groups. You need to get to the local grassroots level. Hopefully they are supportive. If they're not, I think you're in a much more difficult situation. And of course, actually, we saw a court case. We've just seen the culmination of a court case, I think, where the mother of a non-extremist shooter, as far as I know, in Oxford, Michigan, Michigan. The mother was just prosecuted, was sentenced, found guilty of manslaughter for providing a firearm to the son. So, it's such a phenomenal question. Honestly, I think you should do a second PhD on this one, specifically on that question, because I'm going to have to reflect on that one. Thank you for raising that.
Good evening. I'm going to stand because I can't see. Hi, I'm Holly, and my question is, so yesterday in the House of Representatives, there was a resolution introduced to reaffirm that President Trump did not incite an insurrection. And I was just wondering, what effects do you all see the efforts by our leaders in this country to legitimize this event having on the far right?
That's another great question. And that's one of the biggest differences we see in this movement from the 1980s and 1990s till today. Back then, there were no mainstream politicians that would give any credence to or pay really any attention to what they saw as extreme anti-democratic ideas. But as you pointed out just yesterday in Congress and repeatedly over media, you do have elected officials giving top cover to these ideas or giving validation to them. And of course, in the book, we trace a seminal moment at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in August 2017, when, after a lot of back and forth, President Trump said there were, fine people on both sides. And that, this is not conjecture or opinion. It's factual that this movement lit up with glee, that they thought they were now getting a stamp of approval, an imprimatur. And of course, it wasn't just an aberration, because in the first presidential debate in September 2020 between President Trump and then former Vice President Biden, President Trump famously said to the Proud Boys, "Stand back and stand by." And we know from their own propaganda and their own posts on social media, they took this as a rubber stamp to engage in the insurrection. And this is something controversially that literally from the next day of January 6th, I wrote something for the Council on Foreign Relations. And I said, of course, this is terrorism, what happened there. There's no doubt about it, because you just have to look at the U.S. Criminal Code, which is 18231, and I don't know B, and I'm not as good as Jacob. There's a bunch of numbers there, but you can just Google it. And it talks about terrorism being violence or the threat of violence to coerce or intimidate a government or society. What else was January 6th? But you will get very prominent, very learned scholars of terrorism who completely disagree with that. But that's also another reason Jacob and I think there need to be domestic terrorism laws so that you would call it what it is.
Hi, my name is Karishma Mehta. I'm also a former student of Dr. Bacon. I now am a technical analyst at the RAND Corporation, and I do terrorism and truth decay work. So I have a couple of questions, and I'm going to try and ask them together so it doesn't sound like there's 15. But the first one is, God is the first word in your title, and how do you disassociate God from the alt-right? And we have done from the alt-right. How do you disassociate? Because when Islamic terrorism was at the forefront of minds, we engaged local mullahs and imams to talk about this, and is that a way forward here to disassociate terrorism with religion? In that same vein, we've done, as you've said, a lot of CBE outside, and how does that, where we've told like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, how does us not acting affect our credibility on the world stage? And
That's probably enough, Gersh. Those are big ones.
Well, afterwards, we're happy to answer your other questions offline. I'll start by answering with a little-known fact, but you must work in the Washington office of RAND? Okay, so I chose all the furniture and the carpet and the designs on the workstations and all the artwork on the walls. When I was director 24 years ago, I chose all of that. So that's just a fact. And actually, we're going to be speaking at RAND in Santa Monica, but it will be, virtual at the Washington office.
When?
March 15th, 14th? 15th, I think.
Okay.
No, sorry. February 24th, Friday in February.
Okay.
So it'll be 1 p.m. in Washington, because we're out in California then. But to answer your specific question, well, I assume Professor Bacon assigned inside terrorism to you.
Yes.
And that's the operable definition of religious terrorism, and it really applies here. It's when scripture is used to justify violence and when it's communicated by clerical authority. That was very commonplace in the 1980s. It exists today, and when I've said it doesn't, and just the other night, I was told that I was completely wrong about that. But obviously, there's a Christian patriot movement, there's a Christian evangelical movement that obviously pursues a halcyon view of the United States when it was more homogeneous, for example, religiously, ethnically, racially, and so on, and culturally. But in our research, that's not, and of course, you always have to interrogate and you always have to doubt what terrorism experts tell you because, we don't know that much more. I mean, we don't have, terrorism is the ultimate black box. If government is the black box in political science, we're just moving a lot on the evidence, the empirical evidence we have, which may not be the full picture. But we just don't see that same connection now that existed so directly in the 1980s. That's not to say it doesn't exist and it may not influence people, but you don't have leaders of terrorist groups that are actually clergymen, even though they weren't called terrorist groups back then either, but they were actually advocating violence. And that's still different from advocating all sorts of unpleasant or unpalatable ideologies, which are protected by the First Amendment and also by separation of religion and state. So so it's less prominent now, but we're not saying it's not a factor. It's just like the excellent question about bias. It exists, but it was just a limit to what we could research. And what was the second part? Oh, the U.S. Okay, Jacob, you can handle that.
Yeah, so in my position at CFR, I've had a lot of people from foreign countries who work in embassies here reach out to us, and I've had conversations with US embassies abroad. People are panicking about this topic. I had a conversation with a US embassy in Africa where they said after January 6th, they were like, wow, you realize I can't have conversations with anybody here anymore because my mission here is democracy, human rights promotion, and they just go, really? You're going to tell me about democracy? We saw the impact in Brazil last January, where basically an identical terrorist incident occurs there in the government quarter that, I think was probably inspired by January 6th. It's a real concern. And, we're entering a year now we've entered a year with 50 plus elections around the world. They're calling it the year of elections. And traditionally, I think people have looked to the United States to be the exemplar of democracy, elections. I hope they don't this year, because if they're looking to the United States for the exemplar of elections and democracy, they're going to get a bad example. And that is a serious concern, especially as we kind of enter a new era of strategic competition, great power competition. We are very vulnerable both to foreign, direct action, disinformation operations, but also to have our influence be eroded in the various battlegrounds of strategic competition. So it's a great question. It is a problem.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ahmad, and I graduated from Washington University. I'm from Afghanistan, and it's a great honor to be here. And I did not read the book, but I promise I will buy one and send it to my professor. And it seems a very great topic. I took a terrorism class with my professor, and he will love it. I hope he did not read it yet. So my question is, first, I've grown up under the global war on terror. So I understand terrorism. I have seen terrorism, but I wanted you to outline or define terrorism as a phenomenon. Is it a tactic? Is it ideology? What it is, first. And second thing, I want to know about the FTO, that you touched about the foreign terrorist organization and also state sponsorship of terrorism. To what extent these are political tools rather than containing real terrorism? Because I see some countries should be on the state sponsorship of terrorism, which are not there, and some groups like Taliban in Afghanistan should be in the FTO organization, which is not. So I really appreciate your answer on that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the question, and you will be very familiar with terrorism from Afghanistan and from the Taliban and the various other groups, Haqqani Network, Al Qaeda, and so on. Central Asian affiliates of Al Qaeda also active in ISIS-K, certainly. Well, terrorism, it is a tactic, and that's why you can't have a war on a tactic. And actually, the U.S. made even a bigger mistake, because we didn't wage a war on a tactic. We waged a war on an emotion. As I write, the ism is the most important part of terrorism, because it means that it's about politics, and it's about power to affect political change through coercion and intimidation, just like the law. But we declared a war on an emotion. Terror is fear and anxiety, and that's why I would argue the war on terror became unbounded, and why we invaded Iraq. Basically, anything that scared us became justified, which was a huge mistake. So it is a tactic, but of course, it's a tactic that doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's based on an ideological stance that people are committed to use violence to impose on others. That's how I would describe it. Yes, the FTO, the Foreign Terrorist Organizations designation, because Congress has to approve it. It's not just that the State Department, the Secretary of State, decides to designate a group. It has to be approved by Congress. So, of course, it's always going to be political. And interestingly, of the 80 or so groups, more than 2/3 happen to be Salafi jihadi groups, and probably, I haven't looked recently, but I bet you it's got to be up in the 90 percentile, have some Islamist dimension to it, of Islamist extremism, well, without any doubt. One of the things that Jacob and I both praise, but then are very critical of, is in April 2020, during the Trump administration, for the first time ever, the State Department designated not as a foreign terrorist organization, which is the uppermost designation, but a step below that as a specially designated terrorist entity, the Russian imperial movement. This was a really important step forward. And Jacob and I expected, well, Russian imperial movement was designated, other groups are going to follow, especially when the administration changed. There have been no other far-right groups added to this list. And that surprised us because in the last iteration of the National Strategy for Countering Terrorism, not the domestic counterterrorist strategy that the Biden administration released in June 2021, which was the first ever. This is the fourth of the strategies, I think 2003, 2007, and 2011. The one that was released in 2018, again in the Trump administration, specifically called out violent far-right extremism, violent far-left extremism to ISIS. I mean, don't forget, the first three iterations were just about al-Qaeda. So this one was about ISIS, the Iranian threat network, violent left and violent right, and so on. It named two far-right terrorist groups, the Scandinavian Resistance Movement and the National Action Group in Britain. And we thought, okay, they've designated the Russian imperial movement. These two groups are going to follow in short order, and they never have. And I think one could only conclude that it's not just inertia, politics does have a big role. With the list of state sponsors of terrorism, I mean, of course, that's completely political because countries get on and get off it. I mean, North Korea was off it, is back on. Cuba was off it and is back on. No, it's more of a political statement. It doesn't necessarily mean that the countries are actively involved in sponsoring terrorism as much as because terrorism is such a negative word. It expresses our dislike or distaste for the governments of those countries.
Hello. Hi, I'm Taryn Sylvester. I'm with CNAS, and I was also a student of Dr. Bacon's. My question is more about the research process. So flipping through the endnotes in your book, I saw a lot of citations for screenshots. When you're doing research that's so heavy on social media from 5, 10 more years ago, how do you go about still finding those kind of posts and that bread trail so far when things might be defunct or out of date and stuff?
That's a great question. I'm always impressed when people ask about research processes and about the veracity of information. Well, there is like the internet time machine, and actually there's a lot of valuable things, but that's not screenshots and social media. That's things that were on the internet, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, enormously valuable. We were very fortunate in our case in that we had access to site intelligence groups archive going back to, I guess it was 2010 or 2011 when they site intelligence group originally was founded to monitor radical Islamist groups and jihadi groups, and then expanded commendably very early on, started monitoring violent far left and violent far right extremism. Many people actually parenthetically say this, what about the far left? Why didn't you write a book about them? Well, firstly, our book, I think, is 414 pages. That would be one page. It's not to say that violent far left extremism doesn't exist. It's just on a different magnitude. And if you look at this, we could see all the site archives going back over a decade. I mean, the volume of just without violence, but just of social media posts, which suggests, I mean, it could be that there's one person constantly hitting the send button, but just the multiplicity of groups, individuals, the geographic diversity of them is just completely on the far right, completely eclipses the far left in sites archives. So most of the screenshots that we use of actual social media come from site. And if you have access to them, I mean, there's limited access if you don't subscribe to them. I mean, they're a private corporation, so they make money. But at least people could check our work. In some cases, a lot of the manifestos can still be found. We were very careful in excerpting from them and using them for illustrative purposes. We didn't want our book to become like a blueprint. And that's why there's no images in our book. There's, much as I love photographs in books, because I'd rather look at the photographs than the text. There are no photographs at all in this book. I mean, we just kept it, very conservative that way. But in answer to your question, most of the material was verifiable through site. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. But another thing I would mention, and Taryn, relevant to you, especially because you're also a think tanker, is just, being really diligent with your cataloging of things that you come across, because it's something you can refer to back to. So screenshots, like we started writing this book in April 2020. So the screenshots from the summer of 2020, for example, those probably we saved and cataloged, in real time. And, sometimes a news story will come up that has something really interesting in it that you have a feeling like that's going to get lost in history, but I need to keep this around. And I was answering some questions from somebody earlier about how this movement idealizes the IRA. And one day, I was doing some archival research from some old ADL documents, and I came across a quote that was an old leader from the 1980s, I think Robert Miles, right, saying that he wanted the US to become the IRA. Well, I also remember that in the summer of 2020, there was a plot on a Black Lives Matter rally somewhere in Vegas by 3 veterans, and they had mentioned how they were plotting, that they were designing their operations after the IRA. And that was one news story. And I just had managed to catalog it at the time. And that meant that when I was going back through my catalog towards the end of our book process, that was a connection that we could draw just from being kind of patient, diligent with all the stuff that's coming across. I'm not, whatever you're really working on, keep a master document of little interesting things that come up along the way. Because sometimes they're really, really small things that you just know that's gonna disappear. It's not been reported widely, if it's accurate, and it's going to disappear. Well, if you keep hold of that, I think you can get to a point where you can start to draw some really cool connections between moments in history, for example, and some of those themes. So it's a lot easier for me than it was for Bruce, because Bruce, what we didn't mention is Bruce really wrote the historical part of the book. I wrote kind of the last 15 years, so it was easy for me because things were unraveling as I was writing, and so sometimes I was writing stories from like the day of. That makes it easier to have kind of those lifetime pieces, but I think being diligent with cataloging as you move forward, and whatever you're working on is a real opportunity to find some cool connections that emerge over the years. That's a fantastic question. Bruce is going to dine out on that one. Thank you.
Shall we take one more, Zach? And then we can enjoy some reception and drinks and chat with our authors.
Of course. Got one right here.
Thank you. I'm not a student of Dr. Bacon, maybe the only one. Maybe in the future. I'm a graduate of the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence in St. Andrews, and then I'm studying for a PhD in terrorism and political violence here. So Dr. Hoffman, your name's well known about those parts. I'm going to be sneaky and try and get one. Fantastic. I'm going to be sneaky, maybe 1.5 questions. So firstly, you talked about the fact there's no domestic terror legislation, but there is a domestic terror enhancement, which you haven't mentioned yet. So just your reflections on how that works, particularly in that kind of, I guess, left-wing context where I know it best, but generally speaking. And then secondly, you've spoken about the recession in the early 1980s. You've spoken about 2008, and then you've spoken about 2020 as well. So to what extent is this story economic? And how does that compare with different ideologies and how their relationship is involved with the economy? Different ideologies and different economies as well, different countries.
Yeah, both of those are great questions. Take a stab?
All you.
I don't know, all me, but the economic, I think it plays on fear more than anything else. It has less to do with economics. Then terrorist groups are always looking for context, or always looking for an issue that they can capitalize on or exploit. And the fear of economic downturn, the fear of immigrants taking one's jobs, the fear of some global conspiracy that accounts for for the global free trade movement, for example, or for NAFTA. I mean, it's easier to blame these things on a plot than on sort of complex economic forces. And in fact, one thing I left out that really infused this movement in the 1980s with momentum was the farm crisis. There was a real depression in Midwestern America. In fact, one of the great books on that era is called Bitter Harvest by James Cochrane, which is about how farmers were being dispossessed. And rather than ascribe it to being over-leveraged in terms of mortgages or borrowing money for farm equipment, having been persuaded to do so by unscrupulous, equipment salesmen or banks, it was much easier to blame it on Washington, to blame it on a Jewish conspiracy, and to blame it on, immigrants coming into the country that are trying to take over the country and appropriate these things for themselves. So economics is just a very powerful motivator. When it affects people in their pocketbook, they often do things politically. So it's very cynically used by the leaders of these groups. The terrorism enhancement, yes, of course. And actually, there's an excellent case in point. There were two individuals, a Canadian Army deserter and an American, who both belong to the base, which is a terrorist group whose leader is an American citizen who lives in St. Petersburg now. Russia, that is, not Florida. And they were convicted of, firstly, manufacturing their own automatic weapon, which is illegal. Secondly, they were planning a false flag attack on a Second Amendment rights rally in Richmond in 2021. 2021 or 2022? 2020, okay. Unfortunately, yeah, it all blends together, unfortunately. But in any event, false flag operation that they were going to pin on radical leftists, and then, as part of an accelerationist ideology, create chaos and disorder. And then they also had plans to blow up bridges and tunnels, especially because they were based in Baltimore. Bridges and tunnels were especially appealing to them, and also to assassinate political leaders. And initially, they were sentenced to 4 years in prison because, of course, their attorney said they were just joking and none of this was serious and it was beer talk. And the judge was able to extend their sentence threefold. But we're lucky we had a judge that was willing to apply the terrorist enhancement statutes. And this was in federal court in Baltimore, in federal court in another part of the country. That may not have been the case. Or the judge, like we talk about police having sympathies, the judiciary also has political appointees. So that's exactly a reason that we think there should be a law that doesn't leave it to the subjective judgment of an individual judge, but rather is applied as the law should be, equitably across the country.
Just quickly, there's another case from just here in the area. Actually, we detail it in our book, which is available just over there for sale.
And which we'll sign.
And which we'll gladly sign. Of a Coast Guard and, I think, Marine veteran, who was arrested for, the charging document, I think it was, said the prosecutors described him as planning to conduct violence on a scale rarely seen in this country. His name was Christopher Hassan. And yet, stockpiling weapons, and he's got a hit list actually on Excel with like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer on there, a few media figures. He was sentenced to gun charges and drug charges, just like this case in Texas, and got the terrorism enhancement. I think he was sentenced in the end to 13 years. But they challenged that in court. It's just a really tenuous situation. And looking at this case in Texas that I mentioned at the start, I just maybe they'll use a terrorism enhancement, but it's really rare that they do. And it's tenuous. So if that can become normalized, and if it's strong enough to become normalized, maybe that is the interim step, because domestic terrorism legislation is very controversial from both right and left for good reasons. And Bruce and I don't run away from those reasons, but I think the status quo, for all the reasons that we mentioned earlier, the status quo is unacceptable and it's insufficient. And so you have to find a way to move forward, I think. But it's a good question. Thank you.
When I was working in the government before I came to American, at one point after I'd been in the State Department for a number of years, I walked into the office of a senior State Department official and he went like this. And I said, "What is happening?" He said, "When you come in, you never have good news." And I said, "Yeah, that's the nature of this job." And so there is a sobering aspect to a lot of this kind of discussion that comes with the territory. But this was admittedly a particularly sobering talk, I think, in a lot of ways. albeit identifying some areas where things could be done at the same time. So we very much appreciate Professor Ware and Professor Hoffman coming today. And as Jacob has mentioned, maybe 10 to 15 times, there is a book over here. And if they will be kind enough to stay, they will sign it for you, and any of your questions maybe you didn't get answered. We also have a lovely reception out front sponsored by the Policy Anti-Terrorism Hub here at American. And I want to thank you all for coming and for excellent questions from both my students and people who maybe someday will be students too. So thank you very much. And thank you to Bruce and Jacob very much for coming.